Hello and welcome to Americans Learn. My name is Lauren and today I'm going to be looking at a video called Things School Didn't Teach You About the Dark Ages. This is from Ages-Sideprojects. We do love Simon Whistler over here. I know that he has like a really popular true crime podcast that I do listen to on my own. I do words so good for my job. It's absolutely ridiculous how perfect I speak all the time. Anyway, I enjoy side projects. I enjoy Simon Whistler's content. If you want to see more of it, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. And just by liking the video, that also helps me know that this is the kind of thing you want to see more of. Pterodactyl, you told me that you wanted to make sure that I was still doing Learns stuff, not just music. So here we go. We're doing Learns stuff. I am still enjoying all of the music things that I've been doing recently, but I am trying to balance it out as much as I can. And again, things school didn't teach me about the Dark Ages. The answer to that is going to be most of it. I don't think I learned very much about the Dark Ages in school. A tiny little bit in probably world history class that I mostly slept through because the teacher was incredibly boring. And then also in my European history class, I probably learned some stuff about it, but again, it's like that's a lot of history, so we just kind of touched on it, I think. So yeah, I'll be curious to know about which kind of common misconceptions I might have held on to for reasons unbeknownst to me or my teachers. And I'm curious to see what I do not know. What do I not know, which is a lot, but still, about this specifically. Let's go.
To the beginning of the early Middle Ages, also sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. This period, the fall of the Roman Empire, marked the beginning of the early Middle Ages, also sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. This period encompassed the next 500 years, and it received the name Dark Ages because it was seen as a period in which most of the knowledge of the classical world disappeared while society devolved into a bunch of small feudal states.
And I feel like also a lot of what happened too is that there were a lot of regressions when it came to like science, and like hygiene and medicine. And I know there was a lot of like regret, like they were doing okay. They weren't doing great. It was, you know, 1,000 years ago. It's not like they were necessarily doing wonderful when it came to how things are actually safe. Oh, that was weird. I wasn't expecting that. But I feel like I did learn that in the Middle Ages, things did regress a little bit when it came to treatments and how we treated each other a little bit, and how not necessarily treated each other like on a social level, but somewhat on a social level. But I was thinking mostly scientific speaking, like in medicine, we started doing really wild stuff to cure each other. And there were people who really thought that washing at all was dangerous. And so, like, it was, like, lots of smelling salts and stuff that they'd use to make them not stink. But there was also some, like, an increase in certain, like, religious control and what was okay and what was not, depending on what was, you know, religion, so. But I feel like it also wasn't quite, maybe it's not quite as bad as we've all been led to believe. So I guess we'll find out. And I
concept
don't know
of this
what that
time
was at
period
all.
as the Dark Ages has long been challenged and is based on a number of misconceptions and biases. Education on the matter still remains rather limited. So today we're going to look into some of the things that school definitely didn't teach you about the Dark Ages.
Okay.
The supposed Dark Ages.
Some people had the right to vote. Okay.
We generally think of the Dark Ages as being a time of feudal lords and monarchs wielding absolute and authoritarian power over their subjects. While that's not entirely untrue, it was often a whole lot more complicated than that. The specific details would vary wildly from one nation or feudal state to the next, but elections were actually surprisingly common, particularly in the latter half of the Dark Ages. Of course, these elections were nothing like modern elections where every adult citizen usually has the right to vote. At bare minimum, to vote, a person had to be an adult male landowner and usually a Christian as well. But even this was not enough to guarantee a vote. Voting tended to be reserved for the highest nobility and aristocracy, with elections for the highest officers having only a few dozen electors. There was certainly no way that commoners would have the right to vote for who was the next king or pope. The best case scenario for people's voices being heard would be to join a trade guild. The guilds wielded a meaningful amount of power and influence in major cities, and its members had the opportunity to elect the guild leaders. Apprentices and sometimes journeymen did not get to cast a vote, but a master baker or a physician would get to elect their respective guild leaders. These guild leaders would get to take part in mayoral elections. Those mayors would elect representatives of the proto-parliaments that existed at the time, and the parliament could elect the next king. Again, this is a best case scenario, and those without considerable wealth or status often lacked any agency in an election of such magnitude. And yes, sometimes there really were elections for the new monarch. Most elections at the time were for local or parliamentary positions, but in the event that
I guess that would make a certain amount of sense. I think you might just be about to say it, but like if there was no heir like that, then you might have to have an election for
king
it.
left no male heir, or there was a dispute over who was next in line, elections could really be held. Poland and Hungary in particular were known for their elective monarchy, though this practice wasn't exclusive to those nations. However, elections were handled much differently than they are today. Though it did happen, campaigning for a position was generally frowned upon, rather than being the norm. Plato's belief that only those who did not seek power are qualified to wield it was a popular notion, and the elections allowed for people to show that they had been forced to assume power rather than actively seeking it out. It was a common practice for those elected to show reluctance in accepting their new position. Although they were usually just feigning humility, even those elected king might ask for the vote to be redone before agreeing to assume power.
I really feel like we should maybe go back to that. I mean, I know that anyone would still probably be lying about not wanting the power, but just think about it. If campaigning wasn't a thing, then maybe lawmakers would do their jobs instead of spending all of their time texting me to send them money. You know, that would be good. Do your job, maybe. Be nice.
Even if there was a revote, however, the results would never change because votes were expected to be unanimous. This was possible since these decisions were only being made by a roomful of electors rather than the general public, though it could be an extremely lengthy and complex process. If there were two rival factions, they would have a primary process similar to party primaries today. However, the factions would nominate a member of the opposing faction rather than their own. The electors would then begin a lengthy process of deliberation until a unanimous decision between the candidates could be reached. The reason for unanimity was twofold. First, major positions such as king or the pope were supposed to be seats of divine authority selected by God, who was speaking through the electors. A split decision would have meant that the electors had ignored the word of God, which could contain all sorts of consequences. And from a more secular point of view, a unanimous decision was much more practical. If someone was elected king by a single vote, it's unlikely that the unsuccessful candidate would accept that vote, and they might lead an armed rebellion against the throne. Now, this may all have been a hell of a far cry from actual democracy, but the political structure of society in the Dark Ages was far more complex and democratic than school would have led you to believe.
Fair. The Dark Age Renaissances.
The Dark Ages were given their derogatory name due to the perceived cultural and scientific decline during the time. As such, it may come as a surprise to many that there were not one, but two Renaissances during the Dark Ages. Granted, these were more limited in scope than the much more well-known Italian Renaissance. First was the Carolingian Renaissance, which took place in the Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne united a large portion of Western and Central Europe under his rule, and with this new era of peace in the West, he brought with him a new age of enlightenment for the clergy. Anyway, the Carolingian Renaissance was almost exclusively limited to the clergy, and its status as a true Renaissance is somewhat contested. Not only was there the more limited scope than the Italian Renaissance, but the Carolingian Renaissance wasn't an age of newly created social and cultural movements. Instead, it was an effort to recreate the Roman Empire from centuries earlier. But that's not to say that it wasn't.
I feel like we do that a lot.
Some credit this minor Renaissance as single-handedly pulling all Western civilization from the brink of collapse. And even if that's overstating things, it still proved highly influential along the later Italian Renaissance. The Carolingians sought to restore the ancient wisdom of Rome, and they painstakingly transcribed over 100,000 manuscripts featuring Roman texts. Thousands of those have survived to this day, with many of them being...
I like that he's like talking about Roman texts, but that was not... That didn't look like Roman. That looked like Norse.
...of Rome, and they painstakingly transcribed over 100,000...
Yeah, that's like... Those are Norse runes, are they not? Just saying, it doesn't look like... Granted, I suppose I don't know specifically what... I've seen some of these shapes before, though. This isn't... These are... I've seen some of these shapes before. Am I right? Let me know if I'm right. Or are they alchemical symbols? They might be alchemical symbols. What are these specific shapes? Because I know them. I've seen them before. But I don't remember... And you know what, I'll even tell you where I've seen them before. It was in one of the Nancy Drew mystery games. There was like a rune puzzle. But I don't remember what game it was, so therefore I don't remember what the theme was, so I don't recall what the rune puzzle was about, so... Go ahead and let me know.
Manuscripts featuring Roman texts. Thousands of those have survived to this day, with many of them being the oldest extant copies of famous works by the likes of Julius Caesar, Cicero, and Lucretius. As part of the transcription process, the Carolingians sought to create a more uniform and easier to read fonts with clearly defined capital and lowercase letters. This font was mistaken during the Italian Renaissance as the original Latin text, and it became the basis for modern Italian script. This version of medieval Latin, which also allowed for the creation of new words, became a universal language among scholars for centuries. One of the other major contributions of the Carolingian Renaissance was the creation of a standard curriculum for schools that's very similar to what you would have used in school as well. Again, this idea was not entirely new and was more of an attempt to recreate how education functioned in the Roman Empire, but it was still the foundation for the curriculum of the first true universities which would spring up in Europe during the coming centuries. Unfortunately, because the Carolingian Renaissance was limited in reach to the clergy rather than being a society-wide movement, the benefits were short-lived. Within just a couple of generations, much of which had been achieved, reverted back to the way things had been before Charlemagne's rule. The final century of the Dark Ages brought with it the Ottonian Renaissance, named after Holy Roman Emperors Otto I, II, and III, during whose reign it took place. However, while their support, particularly financial support, was crucial for this Renaissance, the efforts were largely spearheaded by Pope Sylvester II and Saint Abba Fleury. In many ways, this was a continuation of the Carolingian Renaissance, so much so that it's sometimes referred to as the Third Carolingian Renaissance. Entire libraries were built of newly translated ancient texts. However, this Renaissance saw more of a focus on new ideas as well, even if these supposedly new ideas were all just being borrowed from somewhere else. The impetus for the Ottonian Renaissance was the marriage of Otto I of Saxony and Adelaide of Italy.
This is a good one. I like this. Is this a guy? Like, okay, so this lady with the blue robes looks very, you. And now this person here with the little holy hand grenade of Antioch might be supposed to be the king, but he does look like his name is Deborah. And, like, very horrified by whatever it is about to happen. Very, like, distraught. It looks very distressed. And this other lady's like, okay, you.
This union of the German and Italian kingdoms brought the West closer to Byzantium, allowing Western Europe to borrow ideas and innovations from the East. The Byzantine influence is most notable in art and architecture, though there were major advances in science and mathematics that reached Western Europe thanks to the Ottonian Renaissance as well. Among these advances that Pope Sylvester II introduced to Western audiences was the spherical astrolabe, a combination of an astrolabe and an armillary sphere used to calculate celestial motion with incredible accuracy.
That is cool. I didn't realize that came about in the Middle Ages. I thought that was a little bit later. So, again, this is why we watch these things. We like to learn about, like, when things actually happened. Because it's like, again, the things that you hear about the Middle Ages, I usually think of it in terms of, in the West, things kind of really devolved. But other places in the world, things didn't necessarily go sliding backwards quite so much.
Sylvester also introduced the system of Arabic numerals to Europe, though it would not see widespread use outside of Italy for another 500 years. While Europe saw some major advances during this time period, as we said, these weren't new ideas that originated as a result of the Renaissance. Instead, they were merely ideas being borrowed from elsewhere. But while it was Byzantine influence that gave rise to the Ottonian Renaissance, these ideas and inventions hadn't originated there either. Western education generally focuses on Western history, which certainly makes sense from a somewhat self-centered point of view. Byzantium is often grouped as part of this because of its close association with the Roman Empire, but the world is a really big place. What schools didn't teach you is that while Western Europe had been plunged into the Dark Ages following the fall of the Roman Empire, the Muslim world was currently experiencing its golden age.
Yes. And I think isn't that why even like once you got to like when we're getting to like closer to Tudor times, where it's like a lot of the people who were doctors and scientists, they were Muslim, right? And like they had controlled Spain for some amount of time, I think.
It began in the mid-7th century, during the reign of the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid and the inauguration of the House of Wisdom, also known as the Grand Library of Baghdad. The House of Wisdom was built as a private library to store the caliph's collection of rare texts, encompassing all of the classical knowledge of the ancient world. Scholars from all over the Muslim world traveled to Baghdad to translate these works into Arabic and Persian, which played a large part in Baghdad becoming the largest city in the world at the time. By itself, this gathering of the greatest scholars of the Muslim world to a location that housed all of the world's classical knowledge would have been enough to spark a golden age. But to throw even more fuel onto the fire, in the early 8th century, during the reign of Caliph al-Mamun, the House of Wisdom was changed from the caliph's private collection into a public library and academy. This golden age lasted until the library was destroyed during the Mongolian siege of Baghdad in 1258. Of course, there was more to the creation of the Golden Age than just the existence of the library alone. It had to be worth everyone's time to come and assist in translating the classical works. Fortunately, the Quran placed a lot of emphasis on education and knowledge. There was a strong desire to both preserve the knowledge of past civilizations and to assimilate it into their own education. As such, the Islamic State was willing to pay a small fortune to fund the translation movement to convert all of the classical works to Persian and Arabic. When dealing with defunct currencies and over 1,000 years of inflation, it can be rather difficult to accurately state how much something so far in the past cost, but according to experts, the Abbasid Caliphate may have spent over $2 billion in today's money to fund the translation efforts. Though it's unclear whether that $2 billion price tag was per year or over the course of the entire movement, the same experts suggest that the most skilled translators received salaries comparable to modern professional athletes, which would suggest that it was $2 billion per year. This also happened to coincide with the introduction of paper to the Middle East. The Muslim world had been relying heavily on papyrus scrolls, but this was not an ideal solution. The papyrus plant is native to Egypt, and it was unable to be successfully farmed in any meaningful quantity elsewhere. Though papyrus fared much better in the climate of the Middle East than it did in Europe, the supply was still a major bottleneck. Even without the papyri being destroyed by humidity, they were still extremely fragile. But it was at this time that paper-making techniques made their way from China to the Islamic Empire, and paper mills were able to produce large quantities of paper that was far more reliable and durable than papyrus, and far cheaper and easier to produce than parchment.
I mean, paper is still hard to make. I don't know if y'all have ever made paper before, but I've had to make paper for like some science class or something. It is difficult.
Surprisingly, these efforts providing access to translations of the entire classical world's knowledge led to some major advancements across a wide spectrum of disciplines. Aside from the advancement of theological and philosophical ideas that would be expected of the time, there were numerous major advancements across maths and science as well. We mentioned astrolabes earlier, and these were of particular interest to the Muslims. Because their religion requires them to pray at precise times throughout the day, making sure that the timekeeping methods that had been developed by the Greeks were accurate was considered crucial. This led to the development of the spherical astrolabe, which was significantly more precise than its two-dimensional predecessor. It was so precise, in fact, that by the time Europe was pulling itself out of the Dark Ages, Muslim astronomers were questioning how a geocentric solar system could possibly produce the results recorded from their astrolabes. While they hadn't identified that a heliocentric model of the solar system was correct, they were already considering it as a very real possibility. Another innovation, and one that you may or may not appreciate depending on how school went for you, was algebra. Maths in the ancient world consisted
Ew.
almost entirely of geometry and arithmetic, mostly geometry. Greek and Roman numerals could quickly become unwieldy when trying to do complicated maths or dealing with large numbers, and the development of Arabic numerals helped facilitate higher maths. And this is where Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, the founder of algebra, enters the picture. There was also Omar Khayyam, who is
No, I know it's useful. I know it's good. This is good things, but also, boo.
largely credited with creating the foundation of Cartesian or coordinate geometry, although a Greek mathematician had used something vaguely similar before. The Islamic Golden Age also led to the development of the law of sines, an important trigonomic equation. Hassan ibn al-Haytham, often referred to just as Al-Hazm, even laid out some of the foundations
Sines, cosines is what he means by that, right?
for calculus. Though he never formalized a general equation, Al-Hazm demonstrated a mastery over the concept of integration as it pertains to calculus. But that's not what Al-Hazm is actually best known for. He has been described as the world's first true scientist, playing a significant role in the development of the scientific method. He also broke away from the two prevailing theories of how vision worked. One theory suggested that vision worked by having light come out of the eyes, while the other suggested that the mere essence of objects would flow into the eyes, thus enabling a person to see the thing. Instead, Al-Hazm correctly suggested that light reflected off objects and into a person's eyes. There were major advancements in medicine as well. It was identified that scabies was caused by a parasite that could be removed without the need for bloodletting or other ridiculous treatments, that smallpox and measles were different diseases, and that hemophilia was hereditary. It was also during the Islamic Golden Age that ectopic pregnancies were first identified, which can be deadly if not treated. Even the seemingly obvious practice of using a control group for medicinal testing began during this Golden Age. Whether it was trying medicinal herbs as a treatment or bloodletting for yet another ailment, physicians recognized that control groups should be used to test whether or not the treatment was actually affecting patient outcomes. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. And to be honest, the list of scientific and cultural advancements that were introduced to the world during the Islamic Golden Age are entirely too numerous to fit into one video.
That I'd kind of remembered. I had kind of remembered that, like, the Islamic I'd remembered about the Islamic Golden Age and how they actually, like, the West kind of, but other places did really, really well. Again, up until the point where it's like you have, even in Elizabethan times, you still have, there was, even in Europe, there was a significant amount of racism going on, but there was still a lot of like Islamic doctors and stuff because they knew what they were doing.
And yet, in many classrooms, this entire period was little more than a footnote compared to the events of the Dark Ages, if it even got mentioned at all. So we hope today we did a little to right that wrong. Thanks for watching.
Okay, great. Thank you, Simon, for elucidating me on that. And again, we did learn a little bit about some of that in my AP Euro class. Again, we just kind of touched on it because again, that was a European history class, so we weren't looking too much at other countries, just mostly Europe itself. But my teacher in that class was very good at bringing in extra stuff and being like, oh, and by the way, this also, little things like that. He was really good at incorporating everything into his class. I really, really wish I'd had him for world history, but I didn't. My teacher in world history was... I had liked history up until I took her class, and then I kind of hated it for a while. And then the next year, because I was so scared I was going to get her again instead of somebody, the good teacher, I dropped down a couple levels and started to take like a different history course. And I regretted that immensely. It was such a bad choice. And then I went back up again to take the AP European class, and I'm really glad I did. That class was amazing. I loved that class. Reminded me that I did in fact enjoy learning about history. So I really hope you enjoyed this. Let me know if you want to see more stuff like this in the comments below. Don't forget to show Simon some love on his channels as well. He's got 8 different channels, so just go whichever ones you want to look at. And go ahead and let me know what to look at next, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.